I'd just like to ask Jason and maybe Emma after to give us just a brief overview of what are now the key asks that are in contention right now as far as the debt landscape is concerned, as part of reforms of these institutions. As Emma has mentioned, that still more African countries are getting into IMF programs, even into their 23rd programs, and are still having to deal with the conditionalities. African governments still are trying to play into the market mentality of these policies, and therefore what are the key reform asks that that can be considered as part of this international financial institutions. And maybe I'll begin with you, Jason, since Afrodad will be participating in this annual meetings next week. What are those things civil society will be bringing forward as key asks as part of reform and just moving forward to be considered?
Thanks. I think I'll speak specifically on debt, and I know Emma will talk on governance and other aspects, culture reform, etc. I think on debt, there are three things really. Number one is for the IMF to acknowledge that the common framework is not working, and that the global sovereign debt roundtable is also not offering the progress towards the debt restructuring that was going to be envisaged under the common framework. And we're going to continue pressing that message when you look at what is happening in Zambia, what is happening in Ghana, what is likely to happen in Ethiopia as well. I think number two is to emphasize that the common framework is actually also excluding a lot of African countries from being able to access any substantial debt relief or debt restructuring or even debt cancellation where it's needed. And therefore, again, the common framework becomes something that's not attractive for many African countries. If you look at countries like Malawi, for example, that is in serious debt distress, on the verge almost of defaulting, it has no other route to access because most of its debt tends to be of a multilateral kind, which is not covered under the common framework. This just gives emphasis to why the common framework is actually not working. So I think that's the second one around debt. The third one is going to be that we're going to need more than just debt restructuring or debt reprofiling or debt rescheduling. We are actually moving towards a situation of debt cancellation. And we can see this very clearly as countries edge or tiptoe to this debt precipice. They're very hesitant, but I think we are seeing this likely to be more and more of a reality, given that now the additional crises such as the climate emergency, how to fund and finance that, is taking a shape of a lot of debt type finance. You're going to see countries trying to do all sorts of kind of things to try and get rid of their debt now, but in the future that debt is going to accumulate given the types of instruments they're going to be using. And I think lastly on debt, I think there needs to be a concerted voice that the proposal for replacing the common framework is through a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism as proposed by African countries in Addis Ababa in June this year, where they called for a global legal debt restructuring mechanism under the auspices of the United Nations. So we are going to have that. And within that includes debt restructuring, debt cancellation. It includes regulation of credit rating agencies, which is, I know, something we're going to talk about. I'm sure the questions will come up. Regulating credit rating agencies and non-debt finance instruments for the climate emergency, and debt cancellation when we have economic and other types of climatic-related catastrophes like the global pandemic. So those are the five big things we're going to be looking at when it comes to debt. So yeah, I'll pause there and then hand over to Emma to talk about the more governance-related aspects that we'll be asking. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason. I'll just share my screen again, but I'm really happy that everything that's been mentioned is basically some of what I had on my screen. So I've just actually added a slide inspired by the discussion just now, just for us to reflect on, when we think about engaging with or so-called influencing these institutions, right? And I think that, I mean, certainly lots of people do it. I've certainly done it. I certainly still do it today. But there is this very almost sort of, what's the word, like standardized way of thinking about how to influence these institutions. And a lot of that is funded by specific sets of donors who have specific sets of ideas about how to achieve impact, right? Getting our language into these policies sometimes. And don't get me wrong, like if you can change sometimes even like one number in an IMF program, like in a loan program, or sometimes get language into a policy, it can have these massive impacts because of these major, the influence of the institutions. But I just was thinking about a piece of research that we're working on at Christian Aid that's coming out soon, where we've been interviewing folks about engaging with these types of institutions. And one of them talked about how this idea, this very standardized sort of think tanky northern way of trying to influence these institutions, where you come up with like killer stats, you have a great report, and it's all about, just if we can just explain to these people what's wrong with the policies or what better alternatives are, we will win. I think that's a really limited way, of trying to influence, because it's depoliticized, right? And so I just wanted to pull up that quote, right? It's really not about their supposed lack of knowledge, right? It's not about us illuminating them. That's quite a paternalistic idea, right? It's really about the strength and value of the feminist or Pan-African, right, movement in its political strength. It's then being able to translate our power into language that is influential, right? So just sort of putting that politics always into our influencing strategies, because it's really easy to lose sight of that sometimes when you're trying to influence these institutions. But then, yeah, in terms of openings for change, like if we think about what is actually shifting power, right? We're in a really, really unique and interesting place now in history, I think, because global financial architecture reform is now top of the international policy agenda in a way that it really hasn't been in a very long time. So at the G20, at the IMF World Bank meetings, at the UN, at the Summit of the Future, we just had like global architecture reform is top of the list. And G77 countries, so representing 130 plus developing countries, are really incredibly strong on not just any global financial architecture reform, but specifically that governance side, and having a bigger role in making the decisions in global economic policy making. And so, a few specific sort of battlegrounds that are really big fights that are happening right now as we speak, in the sense of like shifting that power, right? One way to think about this is like what we've talked about, shifting power within these institutions. And so that's when we start talking about IMF and World Bank quota reform and shareholding reform. So as Jason, I think, was mentioning, there have been these small shifts in vote shares on the IMF and World Bank boards for the last like 20, 30 years that have given small increases to developing countries, but especially the BRICS, the major developing countries, over time. But so far, it hasn't been enough to break that dominance of the US and Europe. What's interesting now is that if you're paying close attention to what's happening with that IMF quota system, we are actually at the margins of what the current quota system for the IMF can do to maintain US and European dominance. And so actually, if we get even again like another small shift, that could actually like break some of the really big power dynamics on the board and sort of lead to these bigger shifts, right? Whether that will happen, when that will happen, is a big question. but we're in a really interesting time because what's the sort of the current quota formula and the current sort of quota structures that they have, they can't, it's not really feasible for the US and Europe to maintain that in the way that it is for very long, especially as this pressure is really increasing now. So that's really exciting, right? But you can also see that, for example, in like the African Union joining the G20, right? That's the G20 is by definition a very exclusionary forum, but by joining it, you might be able to shift a little bit of power within those institutions. But then, as we've talked about, there are other strategies, right, that are much more about shifting power away from these institutions in the first place. And one way of doing that is by shifting it towards other like global, especially UN-based institutions that will have more democratic decision-making structures. So yes, having a UN debt workout mechanism is really important, not just so that we can get to a better global debt system, but it would really fundamentally change and undermine and weaken the role of the IMF in the international system, right? If you create that. And we have amazing inspiration for doing that from the recent tax developments, right? So the African group of countries led on an initiative to start a UN tax convention process in the UN, which really took away power from another very undemocratic northern-led institution, the OECD. So in the same way, we can try to do that with debt, right? But also it's not just about shifting power to those global institutions. There's also a lot of literature and discussion and initiatives in terms of building up Southern institutions, right, as alternatives to these. So the New Development Bank was one example of that, but there's a lot more discussion these days about strengthening like African development banks, for example. So those are all strategies that I think are complementary to each other, support each other, and need to be pursued sort of at the same time. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.